My stepmother destroyed all my mother's treasured belongings and sent me photos of the ashes, laughing as she did it. My anger erupted like a raging fire. This nightmare of a stepmother not only burned my late mother's keepsakes, but also caused my dad to end up in the hospital. Our relationship has always been rocky, and I'll never forget the night she drunkenly boasted about her actions. I burned it all. It was just junk, she said. You need to let go of your mom's memory. Think of it as a favor. I was speechless and just hung up. A moment later, my phone buzzed with a flood of messages from her, photos of ashes with laughing emojis. At that time, my dad and I were camping, so I woke him to share the news. He thought I was joking, but when I showed him the evidence, he went pale. He rushed outside his tent, clutching his chest as he had a heart attack. I called for an airlift, and it took 15 minutes for the helicopter to arrive. While we waited, my stepmother kept calling, but I ignored her. I held my father's hand tightly the whole time. He made it to the hospital and was taken to the ICU, where machines surrounded him. I sat by his side, watching him breathe, terrified at the thought of losing him. I wanted to be strong, but guilt overwhelmed me. I kept thinking that if I hadn't told him, he might have been fine, even though I knew that wasn't true. After what felt like forever, the doctors stabilized him. They said he was lucky to survive, but he remained in a fragile condition. Any more stress could be life-threatening. 4 days, I stayed close to him, anxious every time I stepped out of the room, fearing something might happen while I was gone. The doctors insisted he needed rest, but it was hard to find peace knowing my stepmother had destroyed my mother's belongings. My stepmother always seemed resentful of the way our family spoke fondly of my mother. Last Thanksgiving was the first time my dad introduced his new girlfriend, soon to be my stepmother, to the family. Everyone was curious and eager to meet the woman who finally brought some joy back to his life after years of sadness. I remember sitting next to my dad with my stepmother on his other side, her hand resting in his. She looked a bit nervous, which was understandable for meeting the whole family for the first time. As we were preparing plates for dinner, my dad kept reassuring my stepmother. The conversation, as it did every year, naturally shifted to memories of my mom. No matter how much time passed, she was always present in our hearts during these gatherings. Aunt Linda turned to my stepmom and said, "You're just as beautiful as Mary was," referring to my mom. "My brother sure knows how to pick them," she added with a smile. Everyone murmured in agreement, but I noticed my stepmom's smile falter for a moment. She quickly composed herself and nodded politely. As dinner went on, stories about my mom began to flow. People reminisced about how she made the best pecan pie, how she'd sneak an extra slice to my cousin Jake, and how she had a way of making everyone feel special. My stepmom smiled and nodded along, but I could sense tension growing within her. The atmosphere truly shifted when Uncle Joe began the prayer. We all bowed our heads, and as he always did, Uncle Joe led the blessing. "Lord, we thank you for this meal and the family gathered here today. We ask that you bless our food and our time together. We especially ask that you continue to bless Mary's soul. May she rest in peace and know she is missed dearly every day." The moment Uncle Joe mentioned my mom's name, I felt my stepmom tense up beside me, her hand, still holding mine under the table, gripped tighter. Even though her eyes were closed for the prayer, I could see how uneasy she felt. That's when I realized she was bitter about my mom, about how we still spoke about her, and how, no matter what she did, she would always be competing with a memory. When the prayer ended, she quickly let go of my hand and took a long sip of her wine as the family echoed amen. My dad, completely unaware, smiled at her and gave her hand a reassuring squeeze, but I saw it. Later, during one of our hospital visits, my dad woke up more alert than he had been in days. He looked at me with tired eyes and said he needed to talk to Stephanie, my stepmom. I was worried about my dad and what might happen if we pushed my stepmother too hard, but my dad was determined. He wasn't the type to let things slide, and I knew that ignoring the problem would only make it worse for him. So, I agreed that we would confront her together. After my dad was discharged from the hospital, we decided to address the issue at home. The tension in the air was thick when we entered the house. My stepmother was casually watching TV, acting as if nothing had happened. Just seeing her made my blood boil, but I kept calm for my dad's sake. He told her they needed to talk, and when she noticed he was home, she tried to greet him with open arms. He pushed her away, leaving her stunned. She asked what was wrong, and he didn't hold back. "You know damn well what's wrong. You burned all of my wife's things," he said. For a moment, she paused, her face turning red. Then she tried to justify her actions, blaming him for still loving my mom. He told her that while he loved my mom, That didn't give her the right to destroy her belongings. She shot back, asking why it mattered if they were just things cluttering the house. The argument escalated as she screamed at him. I could see my dad getting angrier, so I motioned for him to sit down. I didn't want another trip to the hospital, but despite his weakness, he shook off my hand. This was all she had left of her mom. You threw it all away just to make space, he yelled. She rolled her eyes, dismissing his feelings, claiming he was being too dramatic. She insisted he couldn't live in the past forever and needed to move on. My dad replied that this wasn't about moving on, it was about respect. That's when I jumped in, infuriated that she showed no remorse. She retorted that it was her house too, that she was now the wife, and if we had a problem, we could leave. She even claimed we should be grateful to her for getting rid of my mom's belongings, saying it would help us heal faster and stop reminding us of her death. My dad countered that he paid the mortgage and that his name was on the documents. He demanded she leave immediately. This seemed to be the last straw for him, especially since she hadn't even visited him in the hospital. When she refused to go, the argument intensified. My dad's face went pale again, and I urged him to sit on the couch. I told her to leave my dad alone, but she didn't care about the pain she was causing him. Once his color returned and his breathing steadied, I helped him to bed. The next morning was unnervingly quiet, with the tension from the night before hanging heavy in the air. My dad, still exhausted and drained, remained in bed. I could hear his slow breathing through the thin walls. I went downstairs, half expecting her to be gone, but there she was, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee like nothing had happened. She didn't even glance up as I walked in, her eyes glued to her phone, fingers flying across the screen. The phone call started soon after. First, my aunt called, confused and concerned. My stepmother had phoned her in the middle of the night, crying about how my dad and I were ganging up on her and treating her like an outsider in her own home. I tried to explain the real situation, but I quickly realized my stepmother had already twisted the story. Then, my dad's best friend called. He was worried, saying my stepmom had told him that my dad was losing control, unable to handle his grief, and was lashing out at her for no reason. She had made it sound like we were the ones at fault, that we were the problem. It became clear she was going to fight, and she wanted everyone to believe her side of the story. I glanced over at her, still sitting at the table, smirking as she typed away on her phone. I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed my coffee mug down on the counter, the sound echoing through the kitchen like a gunshot. "What the hell are you doing?" I yelled. She finally looked up and calmly said she was making sure people knew the truth, claiming my dad and I weren't in the right state of mind to deal with things, so she was handling it. I laughed at the absurdity. She was serious. I told her she was lying to everyone, and I knew exactly what she was doing, painting us as the bad guys. She said she was just protecting herself and insisted that people needed to know what was really happening in our house. She went on a rant about how she'd never been welcomed in our home, that we treated her like a placeholder ever since my mom died. I fired back, reminding her that this was my dad's house and she was just bitter because she'd never measure up to my mom. I told her she needed to leave, or I'd call the police. She stood up slowly, eyes locked on mine. "We'll see about that," she said, brushing past me and leaving the house. As the door closed behind her, I knew this wasn't over. She was going to fight dirty, and if we didn't stop her, she'd take everything from us. After all the calls from family and friends, my dad's stress only got worse. He was barely sleeping, and it was taking a toll on his heart. The doctors warned us that if things didn't change, he might not make it. I couldn't stand by and watch her destroy him any longer. We needed to get her out of our lives, but she wasn't going to go quietly. That's when I realized we needed legal help. We found a lawyer who specialized in family law and began the divorce process. It was tough, and my stepmother fought us at every turn, but the harder she fought, the more her true nature came to light. She tried to play the victim and paint us as the bad guys, but the court saw through her lies. It was clear she had no remorse or empathy, just a selfish drive to get what she wanted, no matter who she hurt. The divorce was ugly. She dragged it out as long as possible, trying to drain us both financially and emotionally, but in the end, the court ruled in our favor, and she was forced to leave. We were finally free from her grip. After she left, it took time to heal. My dad's health slowly improved, though he was never quite the same. The stress had left him more fragile than before. We focused on rebuilding our lives, trying to find a new normal. It wasn't easy, and some days, the weight of everything we had been through felt overwhelming, but we had each other, and that was enough. We didn't talk much about my mom's things after that. The loss was too painful. Then one day, While going through some old boxes in the attic, I found a small envelope tucked away in a corner. It was addressed to me in my mom's handwriting. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it, and tears filled my eyes as I read her words. She wrote about how much she loved me and how proud she was of the person I was becoming. At the end, she wrote, "No matter what happens, always remember that I'm with you in every memory, every moment. I'm there." I held the letter close to my chest, feeling a peace I hadn't felt in a long time. My mom might be gone, but she was still with me, in every memory, every moment, and no one could ever take that away. As time passed, the pain began to fade. My dad and I grew closer, knowing we couldn't change the past, but we could shape our future, and that's exactly what we did. We moved to a new house, a fresh start. On our first night there, we sat on the porch, watching the sunset. My dad turned to me with a small smile and said, "We made it." I smiled back, "Yeah, we did." Through it all, I knew my mom was watching over us, and I knew she would be proud of the people we had become.